Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to House Government Operations and Military Affairs, January 11th, 10 a.m. We are going to be taking up early conversation on H 104, subject executive grants, funding accessibility. And we are going to kick things off by welcoming Representative John Williams. So please take a seat, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, esteemed colleagues. My name is Jonathan Williams. I am the representative from Berry City. I am also the Senior Grants and Contract Manager at the Vermont Food Bank, which is part of the impetus for this bill. My background is in grant writing, and I've worked as a town administrator for many communities. And this bill is not glamorous, but it does address a lot of the process issues that we have been experiencing as a state in terms of issuing funding to entities and supporting those entities with in how we issue that funding. So I'll do a brief walkthrough if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Okay. So section 1 of this bill creates a standard grant application form, grant agreement and reporting form of reasonable length and in accessible language for all state funded grants. That is, as I'm sure many of you know, the state issues funding through many of its agencies and departments. I myself have applied for funding through AOT, AOE, ACCB, DCF, AHS, all of the alphabet soup acronyms. And they are all different. And they are all many of them are very Byzantine. Some are great, some are terrible, respectfully. And we are the size in terms of population of one county of New York or New Jersey. Why are all of these processes different? There's many reasons, but this would seek to remediate that issue. The second section of the bill is the most complicated, but is perhaps the most beneficial to hundreds or thousands of smaller nonprofits and all of the rural towns in our state. This section of the bill would bring the state of Vermont into compliance with federal rule because right now, in much of the funding that the state issues, and especially with regards to pass-through federal funding, the state enforces what is called a de minimis, the minimum rate for indirect and administrative costs. What are indirect and administrative costs? They are costs ascribed to an organization doing business in any capacity. So things like finance, leadership, architectural fees, maintenance of buildings and grounds, so many of those things. And there is a misperception that the higher an organization's indirect rate, the less efficient it is. I'm here to tell you that is not the case. The real costs of doing business for an organization like the food bank is scheduled to testify, so I don't want to steal anybody's thunder. The real cost of business for an organization that operates statewide hovers around 30 to 40% for our indirect and administrative rates. These are real costs, attorney's fees, all that sort of stuff. Finance, especially, is an administrative or indirect cost. Many of you know this. Many of you have operated in this sector or in the business sector where you can appreciate what this means. The state enforces a 10% indirect rate. This bill would allow the state to accept a higher indirect rate in a grant agreement if that entity can show their math. That is what federal rule says. In lieu of obtaining a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement with a federal entity and then sharing that agreement with the state of Vermont, the feds say the state is perfectly allowed to accept a higher indirect rate if that organization can show their math. The next and final section is something that I have been wishing for as a former town administrator for a decade and a half. It would list all of the different state grant opportunities on one web page. It wouldn't create a single grant application portal. That would be amazing. This is a Band-Aid, but a very necessary one, because I can tell you, and I'm sure many of you know, that select board members, town administrators, town managers spend a lot of their time looking for funding sources. If you go on AOT's website right now, none of their grant opportunities are on the same page on their website. Paving, better roads, none of that. It's all tucked away in various corners of the internet. VLCT operated a page like this for a time. I know because I worked there. But it would just be a hyperlinked list, a curated list, so it's updated regularly, of all of the different opportunities available to towns. Imagine the benefit to smaller communities where they don't have to spend time searching and searching and searching for the money they need for planning grants through ACCD, or for a school to look for remediation grants for asbestos or mold. This would provide such a list to public entities. That is what the bill does. It sounds simple, but it would save a lot of people a lot of time. And I believe you might hear about a possible amendment coming that I think very much strengthens the bill and makes it even stronger. This is no pressure on myself or any of you. This is in great part why I ran for public office.
Putting that on the table, huh?
Throwing that out there.
Yeah.
You want, I mean, you can break my heart if you want. It's fine. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. So, I mean, this really, it sounds similar-ish to what was done for the business portal with the Secretary of State's website.
Very much so. It would, the business portal does a lot of things, and I believe Representative Priestley, were she here, could speak to that better than I could. But in part, the list of opportunities, especially, and the standardizing of forms would do, it is very much resembles the business portal. I just want to flag for you, we passed near universal childcare last year. A lot of that money was issued in the form of grants to childcare providers. They had, we took testimony in my committee yesterday from Let's Grow Kids and others. They had a 93% uptake rate on the number of applications. Why? It was a 1-page, 2-minute application that was mobile friendly. Accessibility in this is everything. If we want to see what we do here make an impact, the processes need to be better. And the timing.
No, thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Representative Bloom before we move on to Ledge Council? No. All right. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Mr. Single?
Good morning.
Morning.
For the record, Rick Sagel, Ledge Council. For a lot of you, this is the first time you're meeting me. So it's good to meet you, good to see you, some of you. I kind of give this spiel every time I'm in a new committee. By the way, you guys have one of the nicer rooms. This is, my arms don't hit the walls when I stand out. Sorry, House Commerce is like a closet. This is where I am most of the time. So very, very nice. Yes. No, I won't. Just invite me more, okay? So I am not just new to the office, I'm new to the state of Vermont. And I say that because I may not catch the acronyms. You guys have so many acronyms. AHS, ACTD. I'm learning. But in case you all say something that I don't pick up on, please forgive me. I may ask for clarification, or I may say, what agency is that, or where they're housed under. I am trying my best to learn, but.
G's and Crow.
I don't know that. I don't know that one. But if you bear with me, I'll do my best. So, okay. And adding to it, I did not write this bill. And also Rep. Williams said the same thing. He told you all earlier that this is why he ran for office. And he said, no pressure. I said, thank you. For a bill I didn't write, I will do my best. So H140, You heard from Webb Williams. He did a great walkthrough. I don't want to word for word what he did because I think he did a great job of explaining what this bill is intended to do. But I will kind of walk you through the legality of it, and maybe if there's something you all want to discuss, I'm here for that. But basically, there are two sections. Okay, section one, to me, this is kind of creating the form, right? This is requiring the Secretary of Administration to basically create a standardized form to be used by anybody. It says municipalities, nonprofits, for-profits, and individuals, which really spans the gamut. That's every possible entity in the state of Vermont. And this would only apply to state-funded grants. We're not talking about federal grants. We're not talking about grants from non-state entities, just from the state of Vermont. So once this form is created by a certain date, this would need to be adjusted. It's October 15th of last year. So we would adjust that. Once it's created, they would need to update their bulletin and say this form must be used. If you are going to use a state grant, you must use this application form, the standardized form, okay? And the language there is pretty clear, okay, by July 1st, which again, we would need to adjust that date. On page 3, still in section 1, subsection C, Rep. Williams kind of mentioned this. I'm not as familiar with these indirect costs, but this would apply to nonprofits only. Apparently there is, some formula that nonprofits prefer to use, and that is clarified in subsection C. Part D is reporting. So the Secretary of Administration would report to this committee and the Senate GovOps committee about what they've been required to do once they've done it. Okay. Section 2, to me, this is basically the municipality availability, that if you make a grant available to municipalities, it must be in a database. And Rep. Williams referenced that. So again, just for municipalities, if you make available grants to them, you must have a universal database where these towns can view the available grant opportunities. And again, you have some deadlines there with a grant of $35,000 to appropriate to do this type of database. So that's I kind of breezed through it, but I figured with Rep. Williams also discussing it, I'm glad to focus on something you all would like me to talk about.
Okay. Representative Morgan.
It's just a comment. Excuse me, as a flag. I think other people have caught, I believe, unless I'm missing something, January 15th of this year, that's going to be like a.
Yeah. That's a tight turnaround.
Yeah.
No, yeah, we're definitely going to tweak that. Yeah.
That's 4 days.
Yeah. Yep.
Let's get moving.
Yeah.
Let's get back.
Hey, we are trying to streamline government here. Yes, no, that is definitely on the table with flags. I don't have any immediate questions for you this week. I've had conversations with Representative Williams a couple of times, as well as some others, including Representative Nugent, who I know has, being her outside professional career, is in the nonprofit world. So this is something that she has spoken to and has had conversations. And I know you've been touching on a few things. So
Yeah, so, and I'm also a co-sponsor in the bill happily. We're working on language, but one of the issues that comes up for a lot of agents or small nonprofits and businesses and municipalities is the delay in payments. Sometimes can take a really long time to get that funding. And for a lot of those entities that don't have a large cash reserve, that can cause serious cash flow problems where they have to take out bridge loans to cover their payroll and things like that. And so working on language that would require the state to support those entities during that time while they're processing the payment. So that's kind of the purpose of that.
yeah, no, that definitely sounds like a worthy conversation piece to bring into this. I know I can speak personally from the business side of things when COVID hit and the restaurant industry was shut down, that there was a period of time where the industry was waiting for monies to come in from various programs, but that didn't stop electric bills and rent and things of that nature. So I totally understand where you're coming from. Does anyone have anything else for Ledge Council? Thank you for your time.
Thank you all.
Yeah. All right. And so first up on the witness list, I'd like to welcome Julie Bonner.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Julie Bond. I'm the co-executive director of Good Samaritan Haven, which is the network for those who are unhoused and serve Washington County in particular and Central Vermont as a region. I'll just read my testimony in the essence of time because I know that's important for y'all. So I'd like to address both the importance of the expansion of the 10% de minimis rate for entities implementing key services across the state and the use of more uniform sets of documents for funding requests and grant administration across state agencies. A bit of background. Good Samaritan Haven is a nonprofit organization that provides emergency shelter beds and associated support services to individuals experiencing homelessness or housing precarity. We currently operate 4 shelter locations in 4 towns across Washington County, employing over 40 people and housing currently 82 individuals in our emergency beds. We also provide housing navigation support to individuals in local motels. Good Samaritan Haven is in full support of H140, and it would bring consistency, transparency, and efficiency to the state grant making system, the grant awarding process, and it would lead to a more reasonable indirect cost system. The indirect cost allowance of 10% de minimis is grossly inadequate for the administration of our programs. We estimate that it contributes to about a quarter, 25% of our administrative cost for the entire organization. This rate does not allow for sustainable administering of organizations providing essential services. It doesn't allow for any capacity building to expand our services. Our organization in particular is receiving state pressures to shoulder a growing burden of direct service provision to help alleviate the housing crisis. It's not particularly feasible to expand shelter sites and their operations without expanding the connective administrative tissue that holds that together. So as a specific example, in FY24, Good Samaritan Haven received a HOP grant, so that's through the Office of Economic Opportunity, of about $2 million to operate 3 shelters with 62 beds, a street outreach program, and a site-based motel services program. So following the 10% de minimis rule, we were entitled to about $165,000 in indirect costs from that $2 million. So that amount is enough to pay for one of our co-executive directors and a donor manager, for example. So you need a lot more than 2 positions to operate our shelter network with close to 40 employees. So for example, it does not include an operating director, human resources manager, development officer, finance manager, auditor, the legal fees, associated with our work, and any other costs that are essential to operating a nonprofit providing this kind of essential service. So these are essential roles that shoulder the challenge and the risk associated with running a program for some of the most neediest Vermonters in our state. The higher admin rate or other supplemental funding is warranted if we want the community-based organizations to provide excellent services which are sustainable. And we understand that each of Vermont's community action programs have negotiated federal indirect rates, for example, that range from 15 to 25%. So there's a big span there for program costs, admin costs. So a rate of 20% would give us a much higher baseline and a more reasonable amount to have to then need to still raise in private funding, charitable funds on an annual basis. So as it stands now, we must spend an inordinate amount of time to raise funds to cover the remaining 75% of our administrative costs each year, while also operating one of the most complex service organizations that exists, in my opinion. Another approach that might be considered is to consider annual capacity grants that could be awarded on a competitive basis to supplement indirect costs allowances. This is a system that the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, for example, has used very successfully to build a network of nonprofit housing organizations, considered to be one of the most successful in the nation. Now, I'd like to add some comments about the importance of transparency, uniformity, and efficiency in state grant applications, grant award documents, and grant announcement systems. In addition to our HOP grant that that is administered through OEO, we have had grants through the Department of Health, Department of Mental Health, Department of Substance Use Disorder, and Buildings and General Services. And we learn about these grants in a very hit or miss fashion. Just depends if we are on an email chain or mailing list and so on and so forth. So there isn't a central location necessarily to learn about them. So there have been several instances where we've lost out on an opportunity to apply for funding opportunities just because we simply aren't aware of the open RFPs. So each of these grant applications is vastly different. You know, the process for submission is different. The grant agreements are very different, the process to do them. They don't necessarily share the same format. The general provisions might be similar, but everything else might be very different. And then, you know, each grant has vastly different reporting requirements. So the spectrum in the templates and the formats, the reporting of data requires an enormous amount of time, and administrative capacity to understand the funding landscape, the administrative landscape of a grant. So, in each of these state agencies and departments, just carrying out the requirements and the charge of the grant is, you have to learn it every time. It's just very different. So most importantly is that each department and agency uses a different format for invoicing and billing for grants. So an organization with limited cash flow may have to balance multiple awards that are drawn monthly, quarterly, all at once, at the beginning, all at the end, and then you have to, make up for that in terms of a reimbursement process. So it would save an enormous amount of time and resources for our administrative team if we didn't have to traverse a huge learning curve for each of our state grants that we receive, or the accounting complexity that these variations present to us. And then this brings us full circle, of course, to the limited administrative capacity of a 10% de minimis, because all that time is never captured under that percentage. So thank you for your time. Unless you have any questions for me.
I want to thank you for being here and apologize for coming in late. I was on the radio down the road talking about one of our other areas of policy. Appreciate Vice Chair Byron getting things started. Does anybody on the committee have any questions? Great. Thank you for being here today. Yeah. So I believe that Emma is next. And are you a parody like some of my folks in Franklin County, or a paradise?
Paradise.
Okay.
Yes.
Very much for clarifying. We'll get that right.
Yes.
Well, thanks for joining us. Do you want to introduce yourself for the record?
Absolutely. So for the record, I'm Emma Paradise. I'm the manager of policy and strategic initiatives at Common Good Vermont. And thank you for having me to the therapy and committee members. Common Good Vermont is a statewide program of United Way of Northwest Vermont, and we're a trusted resource and nonpartisan advocate for Vermont's nonprofits. We support the success of Vermont's over 6,300 nonprofit organizations through educational programming, advocacy work, and relationship building. Vermont's nonprofits serve all corners of our state, providing good jobs, vital services, and civic engagement, employing 1 in 7 Vermont workers and contributing over $5.7 billion per year to the economy. The nonprofit sector is the second largest industry in Vermont after state government. These nonprofits address basic human needs such as food, shelter, housing, and they also provide vibrancy to our villages and towns through investment in the arts, libraries, and economic development. Nonprofits working on behalf of Vermonters rely on state grants and contracts to deliver this work. However, funding for these agreements has not kept pace with the economic realities that we all live in, and the systemic processes create additional challenges for these organizations. We recognize at Common Good that partnership among government and nonprofits can be strengthened to promote innovation, collective models of impact, and streamlined processes, all of which serve the long-term interests of our taxpayers and communities. So for this reason, we're here today in support of H-140, and Representative Williams did a great job of explaining the need, as will others you'll hear from today. So today my testimony is going to focus that we recommend amending the bill to create a working group to consider needed reforms to the state's grant and contracting systems that will make it more viable, predictable, and efficient. We would also support the addition of language mentioned by Representative Nugent to address challenges with delayed payments. So for context, I just want to state that this is not a new issue. Nonprofits have been feeling the pinch of capacity and resource constraints for decades. They've also had to work increasingly to fill the growing gap between the cost of services and funding. After hearing more urgent and frequent concerns from nonprofits, Common Good Vermont surveyed the sector in 2022 about their experiences, wanting to understand the problem better and identify potential solutions. We heard back from over 40 nonprofits of varying sizes and missions, and the data tell a really important story about how these challenges are impacting their work and how systems can be improved. I'll just briefly touch on this and share that nonprofits were invited to share about their experience and specifically asked about the following challenges: difficult or duplicative auditing requirements, burdensome reporting requirements, complicated or restrictive budget or invoicing requirements, contract rates that do not cover the full cost of services or do not rise with the cost over time, the reimbursement basis that many grants operate under these days, and that contract rates do not fund overhead or administrative costs. For each of these challenges nonprofits experience, at least 50% of respondents identified having been impacted by them. And when asked which were most important to address, underfunding or level funding was the most important, followed by complex budgeting and invoicing requirements, and overhead and administrative costs that didn't cover the full amount. Those are the most important. And I can submit written testimony that shares more about what we found in that survey. I didn't want to take up too much time today. And Mark Redmond, who's going to speak next, is going to share some real life examples from his experience about how these challenges are impacting his organizations and others across the state. So to conclude, given the prevalence and universality of these challenges, we really need to consider reforms to the state's grant and contracting system to make it more viable, predictable, and efficient. We need to ensure that taxpayers can receive the full value of programs they fund, that organizations can recruit and retain skilled employees to deliver the services, and that community needs are met now and into the future. So we are asking you to support H-140 and with an amendment that would create a working group to delve into these issues and report back with recommendations for improvement. We've shared a draft of this language with your committee chair, and we look forward to providing more input as your work progresses. Really appreciate your consideration and look forward to working together to strengthen government nonprofit relationships. And happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
If others have questions for them. So I don't know how much you all talked about the idea of a working group. And I think I wanted to get a sense from you while we have you in the witness chair, Emma, of sort of who should be on that if you're envisioning, you know, particular stakeholders, folks from the administration, and I guess overarchingly, like, where should that be? Is that a legislative working group? Is that a working group that we task to a particular agency?
Yeah, so our idea was that we think it's, first of all, really important to have nonprofit stakeholders on that committee from a range of mission areas. And so stakeholder representatives, we've thrown out 5 as a number in our brainstorm. We also think it's important to have representatives from the House and Senate, as well as members of the administration, including the Secretary of Administration. And so I think, you know, as these are issues that impact all branches of government, it's really important to have all parties involved there. We would also like to have a representative of Common Good Vermont, as well as United Ways of Vermont, serve on the committee. And it would be helpful to have the support of the administration and legislative council to draft legislation that could then be the deliverable of that group.
Any other questions for Anna?
And I have that outlined in my written testimony I can share too.
Great. If you can send anything you'd like us to have to Andrea, then we'll get that posted.
That's all I have, just to share.
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. All right, next up, joining us remotely, we have Mark Redmond. Welcome, Mark. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Chairman McCarthy, and good morning to you and the members of the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. My name is Mark Redmond. I'm the Executive Director of Spectrum Youth and Family Services, and we are a member of Emma's organization of Vermont Common Good Vermont. Spectrum has been around since 1970, almost 54 years. I've been here for 21 years. We work with homeless and at-risk youth. So that includes young people who are in or exiting the foster care system, in or exiting the children's mental health system, runaways, those suffering from substance use disorder, mental health disorders, youth in the juvenile justice system. About 10 years ago, we started a program to work with multicultural youth, especially new Americans. We're now doing that in Essex schools, Colchester schools, in Burlington. We also expanded to St. Albans about 2 years ago, opening a drop-in center there. We're doing mentoring up there now, the youth development program in St. Albans. Last year, we worked with 1,434 different young people. Because we're in a mental health crisis, we've increased the number of mental health counselors from 4 to about a dozen right now. So that's become a big part of our mission. About 40% of our revenue comes from government sources. 60% comes from philanthropy. We're unusual in that regard. Most nonprofits are heavily, much more reliant, like 95% on government contracts. That used to be us, but we've changed our model in the last 20 years. There are things that we do at Spectrum that we do not get government support for, and we don't expect it. For instance, about 6 years ago, we started a social enterprise, a car detailing business in Williston. We did that because our youth were not successful in the jobs that we were placing them in. So we decided to start a social enterprise. If the state wants to give us money for that, great, we'll accept it. In fact, the Department of Labor at one point was giving us some money, but we don't expect it. That was a decision we made to do, and therefore we appealed to donors, and donors help fund that. And of course, the revenue the enterprise donates. However, there are other programs that we do that Vermont is required to do. The federal government requires Vermont to do it, or some legislative body, it might have been before you, decided to pass a bill requiring that Vermont do X program. So, and Vermont made the decision, we're going to outsource this to a not-for-profit to do, rather than hire state workers to do it. So many of us, I know Tim is going to speak next from Lund, many programs apply. An RFP is issued, a not-for-profit responds. So I'll give you an example. The Youth Development Program. That is a program that the federal government requires Vermont to do. So we work with, in St. Albans and in Burlington, young people in the foster care system. They might have been removed from their families when they were babies. Now they're up to age 14, all the way up to 23. The state pays us to work with those youth. How to finish high school? Do they want to go to college? Do they want to go to a trade school? What's credit card debt? How do you find an apartment? How do you drive a car? Okay, so we work with scores of youth in those two districts, all right? At one point, Vermont covered not only 100% of the cost of that program, but we had a formula. If we had a state contract, it also, I forget what the number was. It was like another 9% to help us cover some of our admin. But what has happened is, over the years, as level funding has gone up for year after year after year, that has flipped to the point where now, forget covering money for admin, now the program is running a deficit. So we're using donated money to backfill the money that we're not getting from the state because of level funding. Now, when inflation was 2%, that was still hard to do. But now that inflation is 8%, 9%, 4%, it's made it really, really difficult to cover those costs. And more, we have to use donated dollars to fund a state program. Also, and Tim can attest to this, I'm sure, we are in an inflationary wage spiral. We are constantly comparing what is Lund paying their workers, what is COTS paying their workers, what is Howard Center paying their workers, okay? Not only that, now we're in a company, what is Burlington Bagel paying their workers, okay? Or what is a salad maker at a restaurant being paid? So we're not even comparing not-for-profits anymore. So for example, the youth development program in the year that we're in, the expenses of it are $753,000, including admin. The amount of money we will get from the state is $562,000. So we will use donated money to the tune of $190,000 to subsidize a program that the state of Vermont is required to run. If you go back to the year 2010, 14 years, and you add up how much we have had to subsidize, it comes out to $1,502,000. In my view, we should not be using donated dollars to subsidize the state, okay? We should be using that money to subsidize our social enterprise. We should be using that money to pay for the drop-in center up in St. Albans, which we chose to do because of the need up there. We don't expect the government to fund that if you want to give us money. So the money we raise should be going to the things that we're making the decision, not to backfill what the state is not paying us. We cannot do 2024 work based on 2020 revenues or 2018 revenues or 2010 revenues. We cannot. We're going to hit a tipping point where not-for-profits just cannot raise the private funds to subsidize these contracts, and they're going to be turning the contracts back to the state, and good luck finding another nonprofit that will take on a money loser like this. The taxpayer, I believe, is getting a fantastic deal by having the nonprofits do this work, okay? We need to do what Connecticut is doing. I was in touch with the MS Parallel organization in Connecticut, what Common Good Vermont is doing. They got an across-the-board 8% increase for all nonprofits 2 years ago. They got 4% increase last year, and now they're going for what's called index contracts. So we don't have to keep going back every year. It's written in the contract, right? It's going to be based on a COLA, some index. So that's, in my opinion, what we need to do. And then finally, and this was referenced in earlier testimony, because we have reserves, we've been pretty successful with fundraising. We don't need to do this, but a lot of nonprofits, because the state, you have to do the work first, and then the state pays you. They're having to go to banks because they don't have reserves to get a line of credit, and those banks charge interest. So they're getting lines of credit to pay their people and then being paid by the state. So now they're having to pay the bank back at some interest rate. So that, again, the money, in my opinion, should go to the way it was, where we had a contract and the state paid up front so they could pay their folks. So anyway, I'm here. If there's any more questions, I'm very anxious to hear what Allison has to say and what Tim has to say as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Representative Murwicki has a question.
Thank you. As someone who's worked in the nonprofit world for decades, I understand where you're coming from, but we are not the Appropriations Committee. And the bill before us was H-140, and we were hoping you could weigh in on that.
Well, I've read the bill. I'm for the bill, and I'm happy to give the same testimony at the Appropriations Committee and Human Services Committee. But I've read the bill, and we're for the bill.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Redmond? Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Representative.
Next up, Timothy Keefe from Lens. Timothy, you're online. Welcome to House GovOps.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. As Mark referenced, I'm the Chief Financial Officer of the Lund Center, which is headquartered in Burlington. We serve children and families across the state in adoption, childcare, and substance use treatment. We also have a residential facility. We're about 75% funded by grants and contracts. Another chunk that's funded by fee for service. So, think about counseling, childcare, and some adoption fees. But we do have to fund the balance or raise the balance in fundraising to stay even every year. I've been with Lund just under 5 years. And when I got here, our admin rate was 14%. Which I will tell you was bare bones. There were a lot of things that we didn't have, and so even the 14 was above the 10%. That rate has risen to 18% in the last 5 years, and it's risen for things like Mark is referencing. It's trying to keep our positions funded. Our admin includes HR. IT is a big piece, finance, and just the leadership of the organization. And IT in particular, we put in an electronic health record system in the last 3 years that is easily our most expensive piece of software. We also obviously have financial software because we have to keep track of each program individually. And the results and that sort of thing, and report those results back to the grantor agencies. So as I say, it's our 14% was very bare bones. We're better situated at the 18%, but we're only recovering not quite half, or just a little over half of that. And so essentially the remainder we fundraise. We pay for with fundraising. So I think we're in a similar boat to many other nonprofits across the state. We are, similar to Spectrum. We're fortunate in that because of our size, we're able to manage the cash flows a little bit better than the smaller ones. But that doesn't mean that we don't face risk and uncertainty at times because of grants that come out late, or and so we're not able to bill and things like that. So I think that's what I really wanted to just communicate to this committee is, when one hears about overhead, one thinks that it's inefficient, and there's a lot of really important things that go into our admin rate that frankly we couldn't operate without. And so I just wanted to, give you our perspective. We certainly support H140, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Tim. I think one of the things that some of us who are familiar with nonprofits, my mom, Pam McCarthy, which I think some of you know, ran the Vermont Family Network for a number of years. And, the kitchen table conversation was about sort of, grant writing and biting nails and how hard it is to fundraise for certain things. And it strikes me listening to some of the testimony that maybe folks don't quite understand what is and isn't included in those indirect costs or overhead costs. So I'm wondering, maybe for the uninitiated, if you or one of your colleagues wanted to kind of give us some examples of the sorts of things that the state is allowing to include in that now versus not, and how that impacts you.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. And in clarity, the thing about the 10% de minimis rate is no one really cares, what is in your rate. It's you get 10%, and and so good luck trying to pay for it with that 10%. But I did list out a couple things that I just wanted to mention. In addition to the people side of it, the HR, the IT, the operations, finance, all that. There are some things that I think everybody would absolutely want us to have that are in our admin rate. So first and foremost, an audit. We have an annual audit every year, squeaky clean, but I don't want to, promote myself. But anyway, we have to have that because of the federal government's uniform single audit. So we have that every year. That costs roughly $50,000. We have insurance, really important insurance between the buildings and officers and directors insurance and all that sort of stuff. We have an external payroll processor that also goes into that admin rate. And as I mentioned, the EHR software. So there's a lot of pieces that and you mentioned, grant writing. We have never found a funder that gets excited about funding overhead. They want to fund direct service. They want to fund people that are doing the important work, and I understand that. But we need to have that infrastructure behind those people to support the organization so that we can be resilient. I should mention that Lund started in 1890. I was not here when we started. But we're proud of that legacy. And as I say, we haven't found anybody that likes to fund overhead. So, but all those pieces are very important. Did I answer the question?
No, I think that's all helpful context, and this won't be the last time that we have this conversation, but I'm acknowledging for this committee, it's the first time we even really looked at the issue in the time I've been on GovOps of how the state interacts with all of the nonprofit entities that we contract with. And, we're the Government Operations Committee. We have a huge scope of work. I think sometimes this is one of those invisible factors of state government that's very apparent, to Representative Murowicki's earlier point, across the hall, but we don't talk about it a lot in here, and it's an enormous part. I mean, I'd actually like to ask our colleagues across the hall if there is sort of a number of, what we spend on contracts with agencies in the nonprofit sector as a total, because it's a huge part of our appropriations process, and the services you deliver that we've been hearing about this morning are very vital to a lot of our community. So I think sometimes it gets we don't see the forest for the trees when I'm always trying to bring it back to the committee and for the public watching at home, that there are these bigger themes and then there are these specific problems that we're trying to solve. So thanks for that, Tim.
All right.
Anybody have any other questions for Tim? Right.
Thanks very much.
So is Representative Logan?
She's on her way, right?
She's on her way. That's great. So if she's not here, Allison, are you available? There you are. I'm assuming. Sorry, there are multiple people on my Zoom screen and the names are very small. Could you introduce yourself for us and go ahead? Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, certainly. Good morning. My name's Allison Mindell. I live in Worcester and I'm the Chief Philanthropy Officer at the Vermont Food Bank. I'm here to talk about the food bank's experience with indirect rates in our state grant agreements, and Representative Williams only slightly stole my thunder with his opening remarks, so I'll repeat a few of his main points, but with some specific examples from the food bank. The main headline is, we did the math and the state said no. So my team is responsible for raising the resources needed for the food bank to achieve its mission to gather and share quality food and nurture partnerships so that no one in Vermont will go hungry. So this mission requires food and trucks and drivers and all the direct program activities needed to source and distribute food. But there are also significant indirect costs, as Mark and Tim have just talked about, that are incurred in the distribution of the 12 to 15 million pounds of food that we distribute annually. So of our $18 million budget, it also includes indirect costs, or costs that are indirect. So these are those costs incurred for a common or joint purpose benefiting more than one cost objective and not readily assignable to the cost objective specifically benefited without effort disproportionate to the results achieved. That's federal language, not mine. So put really more simply, these are not special add-ons. These are expenses necessary to achieving our mission. So for example, food and the trucks and the drivers needed to deliver those food are direct expenses, but the drivers have to be paid, and this takes someone to run payroll. Trucks need to be maintained. Navigation and mapping software needs to be updated. We can bill the software as a direct expense, but the maintenance of it and the updating of it is separate. So this requires accounting and finance staff, HR professionals, software consultants, all indirect costs. So for years, we've been bound to the 10% de minimis indirect rate in all of our state and federal funding, and most private foundation funding as well. We've always suspected that this rate did not adequately cover the true cost of the services we provide under these grant agreements, and that we were under-resourcing some of the core functions that allow us to meet the need in front of us. So to address this, like Spectrum and Lund, we've had to use other funding sources to cover those critical costs. So then 2020 came along, and with the significant increase in state and federal funds that we received to address food security issues created by COVID, we decided to explore calculating our federal indirect rate to try to better understand the true value of these indirect costs. So unlike maybe Lund and others, we don't receive enough federal funds to enter into a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, or NICRA. So we would not be using this calculated rate to negotiate federal contracts, but we understood from multiple consultants, and as Representative Williams shared earlier, we understood that if we can provide enough detail and transparent calculations to that effect, we may use that rate instead of the de minimis with the federal government and with any state entity per existing federal rule. The basis for the rule is so that pass-through entity, the state of Vermont in this case, can review that rate calculation and allow the subrecipient, the food bank, to receive a reasonable indirect rate in lieu of the de minimis rate. So in 2022, we contracted with ML Weeks and Company. They're a firm in Connecticut who work with many nonprofits across the Northeast to calculate indirect rates. They used one of the more common ways to do this, a modified total direct cost based indirect cost rate in accordance with federal rules, and the costs reconcile with the food bank's audited financial statements. There is a complex process to calculate this, and I'm happy to share our final indirect cost proposal that they helped us produce. As a result, we ended up with a rate of 18.1%, very similar to Lund, and that includes the cost of our purchased food. This calculated rate is based on our actual cost incurred for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2021. And it was the rate that we attempted to include in all of our grant agreements with the state that year, DCF, AOE, DOH, among a few. None of those departments or agencies would allow us to use this rate and would only let us include the 10% de minimis rate in our grant agreements. Increasing our indirect rate from 10% to our actual real life rate of 18.1% would not result in increased funding from the state, but it would allow us to reallocate a greater percentage of the funds to cover the true cost of what it takes us to fulfill our mission and the grant requirements. The changes offered in H140 would allow Vermont nonprofits who are working with the state of Vermont toward common goals, like the food bank, to more transparently allocate funds and receive the support we need to do this work. So we can focus on what we do best, getting people the food they need and want in accessible and equitable ways. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. Questions from the committee? I think what might be helpful, and I wouldn't want to put anybody on the spot with this, is if somebody could give a sort of simplified example to the committee for the next time we take testimony of how the money would work differently in terms of, I think I understand this, and I've looked at this a couple of times in terms of examples, but it might be great to have a couple of really clear examples of what it would be like for an organization to have flexibility on a negotiated rate, indirect rate, rather than the 10% de minimis, because I think the increase in the rate leads any layperson outside of this world to go, oh, that means you want more money from the state. And I heard you really clearly, and I say, and just confirm this for me, Allison, that you're not asking for the state to put more money in. It's about a flexibility about how you use that money.
So, for example, right this year, we have a $3 million grant from AHS via DCF to distribute food to Vermonters across the state. So we currently have a 10% de minimis rate. That means we capture 10% of 3 million. What we're asking is for us to be able to use the 18.1%. We would still be getting $3 million from the state. We would just be able to allocate those funds in a way that actually addresses the true cost of what it takes to source, distribute, and support distributing that food.
The question that brings up for me on the other end is, would that allow you to essentially, the money that you do get from private donations and from philanthropic sources, from fundraising, to have more of that go to direct services? And I know some of those sources will only go to direct services.
Yeah, I think you answered that question better than I could. I think.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Representative Hancock.
Thank you. I think I'm still missing something in this equation, that if you're not asking for more money from the state, but you have higher expenses and you don't want to take that from donations, where's that extra money coming from? I know this sounds really like a very basic question, but I'm still not getting it.
For the example of indirect rate, this is separate than what was talking about, but we're subsidizing that through other fundraising. So the true costs, whatever we're not allowed to use as the percentage from the $3 million, if we're only able to spend 10% on indirect and not the true cost of 18%, we're taking that from other places, other funders.
I think I wasn't clear. Thank you. So out of that $3 million, if you use more than 10%, how are you making up that difference to, for instance, buy food for the food bank? Is that through increased donations?
If we were spending if we were spending the true 18%, and you're saying that would reduce the amount of food we could purchase, is that the question?
Yes, I guess that's what I'm
doing. The $3 million is to get food out, and the true cost of that is inclusive of the 18%. So I guess if the state of Vermont is not giving that money to buy X number of pounds of food, they're asking us to source and distribute and get food out, and we're saying that actual cost is 18%.
No, I understand that. I just don't know where the extra, am I missing something really basic here? You know where I'm going?
Representative Williams is going to try to, this is why I was asking this. I wanted everybody to wrap their heads around this, and I know it's hard. So this is a perfect question. This is why we're here this morning, in large part. So
because I thought I understood this.
Representative Kate Logan works as well. So
yeah, so Representative Logan, since you haven't testified yet this morning, would you just introduce yourself, and I'd love to hear both of you try to frame this up for us.
Yes, absolutely. Representative Kate Logan. I serve on the Committee on Environment and Energy, and my other professional hat is serving as the director of the Vermont Coalition of Runaway and Homeless Youth Programs at Elevate Youth Services. I can briefly try to address this. All of my funding for my statewide program is federal grants. So reading Representative Williams' bill about the changes requested at the state, it's like an extreme scenario for people who rely on public funding for the services that they provide. We provide housing and wraparound services for runaway and homeless youth aged 12 to 24. I can speak to I understand the difficulty you're having understanding the indirect cost rate and how much of a difference it would make to nonprofit organizations to be able to negotiate a rate that is accurate to their spending. So when you get a grant you get a budget, list of eligible costs, things that you can actually spend money on for programming. You usually get to charge, you usually get to factor in about 10% of the cost of that for administration as part of the budget. And then there's the indirect cost rate that you can further negotiate, but then there's the 10% de minimis federal rate. Essentially what this is saying, right, is that of this money that you're getting, 90% of it needs to go into services, and all of the other people at your organization and the cost that it takes to run the organization has to be done on 10% of your budget. That's impossible. It's just not feasible. You'd have to be working intense with no internet access. And so it's a very practical step that nonprofits get audited every year. Every penny has to be accounted for. And the budgets, even probably the 18-19% range for indirect cost rates at the nonprofit level is probably pretty conservative, really budgeting tightly to manage operations and all the administration of the programs.
Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Thank you. To answer your question, there's $3 million from the state of Vermont. The Vermont Food Bank's budget is $18 million. If the state of Vermont insists that only 10% of that $3 million can be used to do HR, finance, rent, fundraising, all of that, we have to raise the rest of that money from private sources.
That was exactly my question.
And we do.
Yeah.
And we have an 11-person
Okay.
development team. More than half of the food bank's revenues comes from people who give $30 a day.
Yeah.
$30 a year.
I totally understand. I just needed that answer. Where is the extra money coming from? If it's not coming from the state.
And happy. And that is true of Kate's organization, I'm sure, and everyone who spoke here today. We are tasked with finding the money. And if we can't find it, people lose their jobs or doors are shuttered and people lose services.
Yeah, and I'd love to add to that, that 10% rate, you have to pay for your fundraising out of that. It's not enough to pay for staff to do the fundraising. So then you're fundraising to pay for your fundraising, and then you're making money that pays for your administrative costs. It's kind of a racket, frankly. It would make it a lot easier for nonprofit organizations if they could negotiate a higher indirect cost rate. So I highly support that piece of the bill, as well as the streamlined administrative options that are part of the bill as well, that I could certainly, given that I get my grants from the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Health and Human Services, I would appreciate a considerably more streamlined grant writing process. And unfortunately, now I have to get back up to my own committee. So thank you for inviting me, and I hope that was helpful.
So helpful.
Of course.
Representative Williams, if you don't mind being in the hot seat still.
I would love.
I've got, we'll let Representative Hango wrap up and go to Representative Hooper and then go to Representative Watt-Timmons.
Thank you. Just a really quick, if the 10% de minimis rate is federal, how do we renegotiate with the feds?
Sure. So the federal government says for federal money or for federal pass-through money when they give it to the state of Vermont, and then it comes to all these thousands of nonprofits, you can do two things. You can obtain something called a NICRA, or a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. Loving the acronyms. That takes a lot of time and resources. And if you're too small an organization, frequently you can't, or they won't let you do it. If we had a NICRA, even the food bank, one of the larger organizations, if we had a NICRA and we could show it to the state, maybe they would say, sure, you can have an 18% indirect rate. Okay. The second thing you can do, federal rule says OMB circular 3, I forget the number. Federal rule says in lieu of a NICRA, because we know, the feds know, they understand, they're humans, that it's incredibly difficult to obtain one of those things. If you can calculate and show your math and they give you the formulas with your indirect rate, show it to the state agency. And if they can accept it. They can accept it. Okay. Further, I have been told, and our consultants have told me, that if one state agency, accepts that indirect rate, all of the other state agencies are allowed and are perfectly able to accept that indirect rate as well. In every single application that the Vermont Food Bank has submitted for funding, Agency of Agriculture, DCF, Department of Labor, all of them, it's my job. They have said no. Again and again and again, they have said no. Okay. And there is no reason that they have to say no. There is no reason.
So they've said no to your negotiated,
Our math. Yes.
Yeah, your math.
I have spoken to Undersecretary, Deputy Secretary Farnham when he was in that role. And he said it's simply a matter of AOA communicating to the other agencies that they're allowed to accept the higher indirect rate. There might be a misperception out there. I have talked to the Agency of Digital Services. They understand what we're trying to do here. I have spoken to Secretary, multiple other secretaries, Joan Goldstein from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, Commissioner Goldstein, the current Secretary of the Administration. They understand what the issue is. I think they would prefer to do it by rulemaking. I don't frankly like that idea. I would like to see it in statute because who knows what the next administration might do. Yeah.
Representative.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So if I have my head wrapped around this, which I'm not entirely sure I do, at this point, you use the word often, we have to go out and raise that money from other sources.
Sure.
If indeed we were to consider an ability to raise that to an actual number, would there be an impact, either direct or indirect, on the service that is offered to the citizen? The amount of food that gets purchased, anything like that, if you no longer have to? A lot of fundraising.
So this is slightly awkward for me because I'm wearing two hats at once. I'm a representative and I'm a food bank employee and have been for 6 years. I've also worked in town administration. Because we have to raise the money for our actual direct rate expenses, that is money that we could be spending on food otherwise. The Vermont Food Bank, the last time we measured it, served 1 in 4 people in the state, not every day, but annually. That's 153,100 people. During the pandemic, we served 1 in 3 people in the state, or at least 1 in 3 people were food insecure and accessing our services. Because organizations, not just the food bank, any nonprofit, Good Samaritan Haven, whomever, because organizations have to spend money on our administrative costs, those organizations cannot then spend the money on shelter beds, food, teaching youth how to drive a vehicle, as one person said. We have to spend, because the state is being, in my opinion, punitive in enforcing this rate. Those other organizations have to go out and fundraise. And let me tell you, there is not an endless supply of money from the private sector to fuel these services forever. We are on the lower, as it's called in some circles, we are on the lower end of the philanthropic divide in terms of how much money is available from the private sector to meet these needs. And these needs are astonishing.
So you're getting to the point where you're going to say the net effect is 0. Peter pays Paul.
Representative Waterton.
Thank you. I don't know a lot about this. So I'm wondering, well, I have a couple questions. The first is, does this de minimis rate exist because it's trying to sort of police isn't the word I'm looking for, but just like kind of, you know what I mean? To manage how much of the money that nonprofits get, that it's not being like wasted or spent inefficiently or illegally, or is that why you did this in the first place?
In part, there are, those mega nonprofits. We'll use the example of the American Red Cross, where they're paying their leadership hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. Those organizations exist. They do not exist in Vermont, as far as I know. Yes, it is designed. There's also a very antiquated misperception that how efficient an organization is tied to its administrative rate. And I get asked this question as a grant writer all the time. I'm sure you do too, Representative Nugent. What's your indirect rate? What's your overhead? And they don't want to see it above a certain rate because they think, oh, that means you're not actually doing the work. That is a false dichotomy. That is not true. Indirect rates, administrative costs are real expenses. Okay. The Vermont Food Bank, again, I will use my employer. I'm so sorry. We own our facility in Barrie, a warehouse that serves all of central and northern Vermont, 300 network partners. But we rent our warehouses in Brattleboro and Rutland. We operate 3 warehouses in total. That rent is an indirect cost. But those warehouses are storing and distributing millions of pounds of food to hundreds of organizations at hundreds of schools and senior centers and SASH sites across the state. And so that rent, the upkeep and maintenance of that facility, the repairing of forklifts and all of that, the software, as was mentioned, those are indirect costs. Those are real costs. So yes, to answer the question.
I think that Ms. Paradise might be able to build on answering your question, Representative Waters Evans, and I see your hand, Representative Higley. I'll get to you next.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in on one point that I don't think has come through as much. So nonprofits, how their work comes in, nonprofit employees are really important to the work that nonprofits do. And nonprofits are having a really hard time filling open positions, paying their employees livable wages that will keep them in these positions to keep performing this work. And so having an adequate indirect cost rate that allows them to pay livable wages to their employees will also supports how much they're able to give back to the community as well. 1 in 7 Vermont workers is a nonprofit employee. So just wanted to add that additional context. That's really important to service delivery as well.
Absolutely.
My follow-up question that kind of leads into it, thank you, is how long ago was this 10% figure decided upon? Like, is it decades old? Is it from like, because it seems like it's not keeping up with inflation, like what the actual costs are to employ people and to do all these things. So is it misguided? Is it outdated? Is it
yeah,
in your opinion? Yeah.
And if please interject. It is decades old at this point. The feds are raising their indirect de minimis rate right now to 15%. State is not.
Okay. One more question. That doesn't have to do with that, but it has to do with the database. Can you speak, and it doesn't have to be a huge thing, but I'm wondering if this database of the grants that are available for nonprofits, do you see that in some way saving money for the nonprofits themselves? And if so,
yeah.
I'm just asking if there's kind of a correlation between the budget and kind of creating that would it actually result in spending less money as a nonprofit?
So just to clarify.
Yeah.
And I don't like to call it a database because a database would imply that it is like a grant application portal.
No, it's a list.
It's a list.
Yes, okay.
I could, in my basement, at my computer, create a curated list of just with bullet points and hyperlinks of all the different grant opportunities that the state of Vermont offers. If it's just for towns, which this bill is, it would be maybe a couple dozen opportunities. If it's all of the different grant opportunities for nonprofits and municipalities and schools and hospitals and everything, it would be a list maybe nearing several hundred opportunities. Because this is how we appropriate funds in the state of Vermont. This is what we do. When the legislature appropriates $3 million to an organization, it is handled as a grant through the agency that needs to do it. So, you know, in my perfect utopian Vermont, someday there is a grant portal that is vermontgrants.gov. And a town manager goes to that website and says, I need money to pave a 3/4 stretch of road. Okay. And they got that information from their public works group. They go there, they enter the amount of money. It takes 2 minutes. They don't need to know where the money comes from. Who cares? The state can track it on the back end.
Yeah.
But that's, I've been told, 5 to 10 years away and costs $10 to $12 million. That is not what this bill is doing. What this bill does is create a Band-Aid, which is that list that I could develop in my basement. But I don't have the time.
Right.
Because my community got flooded, in part. So yeah, does that answer your question?
It sure does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Higley, thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, in listening to the conversation this morning, it brings a question to mind for me. I'm sure all nonprofits, you know, have in whatever area that they indulge in are proud of their organization. You've talked about so much about administrative costs and that 10% de minimis rate not making it go. What about an economy of scale here with possibly, I mean, this morning there's been 4 organizations that basically do the same thing. I'm sure it's not all the same, but again, if you had an economy of scale here where those administration costs and so on could be in one organization, wouldn't that serve the community who's being served by whatever it is a little bit better? And then I guess another question that would go along with that is how many more nonprofit organizations can file for these limited grants? And how would that affect or help or hurt the process? Again, what if a new Vermont Youth Support Organization started up and applied for grants? There's only a certain amount of money that can go around. And again, I'm looking at an economy of scale and whether or not certain organizations would want to combine and look at that.
I'm happy to speak to that or let Emma speak to that. The food bank is the only food bank in the state of Vermont. We were created in 1986 out of an effort from multiple central Vermont food shelves to create a space where they could store and distribute food more efficiently. And so I think we've reached the limit of our economy of scale in that regard. The food bank supports nearly all of the food shelves and meal sites in the state of Vermont. Those other organizations, I think to some degree, it is a local control issue, much like many of our communities. And I know many folks in here support local control where the organizations in those communities know best what is needed and how to support the persons. And I would also contend that if the state of Vermont, as it has demonstrated that it tends to do, which is to effectively farm out a lot of the work that state government might do. I would hold up the 211 system as one such example. If the state of Vermont is going to continue to do that, we need to be able to support those organizations that are functioning at both a local, regional, and statewide level. And Emma, I don't know if you have anything to add.
And I think I would reiterate, I think there is a certain level of local control. These organizations are small, they're in touch with their communities, they understand what's going on at the local level. That's not to say that there aren't opportunities to explore efficiencies of scale, but I think that, you know, their ability to respond quickly to events faster than perhaps the speed of government operates at does have its advantages. And I think it might be, you know, this bill doesn't specifically address that, but definitely something that could be explored as long as we're not losing that flexibility and local connections as well.
So I had one hand up in the room here. I want to, and I'll go to Mark first, then we're deferring. Mark, go ahead.
It's a good question, Representative Higley. I do appreciate it. All I can say is anytime someone approaches me, oh, we're thinking of starting a nonprofit to do that. And I'm like, no, don't do that. We already have enough nonprofits. Look for somebody who's already, so a good example, we're doing mentoring in St. Albans now, right? Could have started a whole mentoring or no, Spectrum knows how to do, we know how to do it. Don't do it again. So I would say that's my common refrain.
Good morning.
Welcome.
I'm Lauren Glendavidian, and I work at CCTV in Burlington, Vermont, and we were the founders of Common Good Vermont in 2008, when this conversation had already been going on for 2 decades. So I just wanted to point out this is a kind of legacy conversation that's very important to address for the reasons that have been spoken to today. One of the most, the greatest benefits of having Common Good Vermont, and I'm just speaking to Representative Higley, is precisely the conversation of not starting lots of new nonprofits. Because of Common Good Vermont, there's a place to come and say, I want to start an equestrian organization. And Common Good can say, well, there are 3 animal rights organizations that would be of interest. So let's create some economies. That said, and to the point of the de minimis rate, which we have struggled with in the state and federal grants that we've had, and even had conversations, difficult conversations with private philanthropists on this topic. When we as a business, if we're running a business, whether it's a nonprofit or not, we know that for every hour that somebody works, there are a whole set of costs that need to be carried in the price that we charge. So we may be charging $20, paying $20 an hour for a person, but then, of course, we have to carry their health insurance, and then we have to carry the space that they occupy, and we have to carry the services, the cost of the services that they deliver. So that's a financial analysis that we as business people do. And for years, nonprofits didn't really operate like businesses. We thought, oh, $20 an hour is what it costs us to operate. Well, you're seeing a growing sophistication because the rubber is meeting the road. And the fact that the food bank just started doing this kind of analysis in 2020 is an indication that it is very long overdue for all of us as the nonprofit sector, for whom the state of Vermont 30 years ago decided that we were going to carry out the work of the state, right? So this is a compact that was made many, many years ago, even in the 90s. So when that compact was made and that shift was done, we enjoyed these funds to deliver the service, but it isn't until really recently that these organizations are understanding the cost of doing business. And when you sit down and you analyze the cost of doing business, you realize that 10% as an overhead cost on every labor hour that you work is completely a money losing. I mean, you're going to go out of business. And that doesn't even include the margin that you need that is over and above the cost of doing business that any smart business carries. So they have a cushion. So when the state doesn't pay them, they can draw on their reserves. And these concepts have been considered for a long time as not okay for the nonprofit sector. I mean, not only by the state in terms of how this is structured, but by private philanthropists and funders who resisted our efforts to show what it really costs to do business. And so being in a nonprofit organization and running a nonprofit organization requires you, under any circumstance, to raise unrestricted funds from philanthropic sources in order to buffer and be able to deliver the services. And what we're seeing here, I think, is a fundamental shift, a required shift in how we think about what it costs to deliver nonprofit service. I just wanted to add that as context, because the truth is for a $3 million grant, if you increase the de minimis, you're going to deliver less service. And that's the truth of it. And you actually, that's a conversation that Mark Redmond doesn't have a hard time having, but a lot of nonprofits have a hard time having when they go and they sit down with the grant organizations. So we have to be realistic about what it costs. And I just wanted to kind of add that historic framework. So thank you.
Thanks, Lauren, for stepping up. That's totally fine, I think. So, committee, we have one more witness on our schedule who is going to be available, I think, a little after 11:30. That's 3 minutes away. And then I think we can potentially break a little bit early. While we're waiting for that witness, I thought it might be useful for us, since we've heard from a number of people this morning. I think we've started to sort of define what the issue is. And I know that Representative Nugent and Representative Williams, beyond just the original H-140 as introduced, I think they teed up for you while I was out, that these couple of other issues of indirect cost and the diminished rate that we're just talking about here, and the proposal from Common Good of engaging the administration, stakeholders, and legislators in a conversation beyond this legislative session about how to tackle some of these issues and come back with some legislative recommendations moving forward might be useful. So I'm just kind of wanted to open it up to the committee and see where folks are in terms of how you'd like us as the House Gov Ops Committee to take on this work, and if there are already pieces of language that might be kind of out there floating that you want to add to H-140 as introduced.
I think I mentioned it, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Representative Nugent.
I did bring it up just before you got here, I think. The language that would, sorry, I'm just gonna get my notes.
That's fine. We don't have to talk about everything. I just wanted to get a sense of, does the committee want to do this work? I think oftentimes when it has to do with nonprofits like many that we've heard from today are kind of in the human services world, or right? That's like a human services thing. And I know from talking to Representative Wood, this is very much the mechanics of how we do this is very much a government ops thing. So I wanted to kind of resolve that particular jurisdictional question. I think since we're not talking about the amount that's being appropriated, but the sort of structural decision around how grants are administered, it's an administrative thing, and we want to work with the AOA, and that's very much a GovOps thing. But I don't think anybody's been willing to our previous witness testimony. There hasn't been a legislative committee that's been willing to like grab this rail and try to work it out. So just wanted to get a sense from the committee of how much people want to do that. Representative Hooper.
I just realized that I need something clear about this. When you're taking federal and state dollars and there's a difference between the amount that you're allowed to charge, does one restrict the other so that you can't basically represent your expenditure of funds for gas for the truck or whatever, and one version to not the other, or are they completely compatible?
If it's pass through monies, federal monies through the state of Vermont, all federal rules typically apply. So whatever, but the state is the one who it then imposes additional frequently requirements in terms of reporting, et cetera. You will hear again and again, oh, the feds need us to do this, the feds need us to do that, when I have found that is not always true. Because I have communications and frequently work with USDA and others. Does that answer your question, Representative?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's vague.
In terms of jurisdiction, I just wanted to add that you heard a lot from the nonprofit community today. Municipalities are nonprofits. Local governments are nonprofits. All of the things that were discussed about indirect rates and everything would apply to small, frequently rural towns and their overworked town administrators and treasurers and clerks and select board members. and volunteers. And I have spoken to the league. I spoke to Karen Horn and Gwen Zarkov about this bill last year, and they are supportive. I can't speak to current, they are no longer with the league, but I am certain that the league and its constituent municipalities fully support this work. And this, I believe, pertains to your purview. Thank you.
Thanks again, Mr. Chair. Just in regards to the bill itself, I mean, I know there's a study committee being considered or looked at, but you know, the bill itself talks about the Secretary of Administration having a piece in the Secretary of Digital Services. I would certainly appreciate hearing from them whether or not some of this stuff is even doable. I mean, is $35,000 enough to put together something in that length of time, and what was necessary? There's so many questions that they should be answering as well.
Oh, yes, absolutely. If we continue working on H-140, we will be having multiple people from the administration come and give their perspective on this, for sure. This is an issue that affects a lot of state government, as Representative Williams just outlined. Representative Boyd, I'm sorry, you had your hand up before.
I have a clarifying question about the words on the page that maybe Representative Williams might be able to answer. Just, we've been focusing a lot on the indirect costs, which is mainly pointed out in section 1, little c. And I'm wondering if this language would reduce the need for the two options that were highlighted of either providing a negotiated indirect cost agreement or like showing your math and having the agency then agree or not agree to with this language. Remove those two.
This language would, again, bring the state of Vermont into compliance with federal rule. So frequently, smaller nonprofits don't have the capacity or are just simply too small to obtain a NICRA with the feds. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So if they could show their actual indirect rate calculations to the appropriate state agency on a grant, and that agency accepted it, yes, it would remove the need to obtain a NICRA. This bill is not raising the indirect rate of the state of Vermont. That is not what we're seeking to do. What we are seeking to do is simply allow entities, towns, schools, hospitals, whomever, to use a higher indirect rate if they can show their math.
So our last scheduled witness is here via Zoom. I want to welcome Nicole Miller. Do you want to introduce yourself and please tell us what you know?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Nicole Miller, and I'm the Executive Director for Vermont After School. Chair, shall I go ahead with my full testimony?
Oh, yeah, please. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. We're a statewide nonprofit dedicated to strengthening programs, empowering youth, and expanding access to after-school and summer programs so that all Vermont youth are active, engaged, connected, and heard. As many others before me, I'm speaking with you today to share our experiences as a nonprofit organization in Vermont who has a long history of working with several of the state agencies. We understand through H-140 that there's an opportunity to improve the varied systems of state-funded grants, and my hope is that this committee finds our feedback helpful in identifying some of the areas where those systems can be made more efficient and less challenging. Our biggest challenge concerns timelines of grants being executed and reimbursement for work being completed. Regarding the timelines of grant execution, while not without the hard work of many state employees, grant agreements often are not executed until 3 to 6 months into the work period, even after budgets and scopes of work are prepared several months in advance. When they arrive, they are backdated, but that doesn't really help nonprofits because during the interim, we must still plan for and execute that work with no written guarantee of when that agreement will be finalized. These delays in turn delay any subcontracts and cause great uncertainty for leadership within organizations. Without agreements in place, we cannot request reimbursement for completed work, endangering the livelihood of our employees. That's a burden that of ensuring employees are taken care of is one that leaders from across many sectors undertake knowingly. However, the difference for nonprofits working with state grants and contracts is that we're not in control of that timeline. We can end up carrying months and months of expenses well beyond what was expected, causing significant cash flow challenges. Regarding the timeliness of reimbursement requests, in our experience, grants are typically on a monthly or quarterly reimbursement basis, usually with a payment term of net 30 days. When operating smoothly, this process works okay. Of course, the nature of reimbursement is challenging, but it's doable. However, when those delays do occur, it becomes very financially risky. For example, a grant that we have might have a reporting period that covers July, August, and September. By the time we close our books to make sure that all of our expenses are captured, our report would be turned in at the end of October. And if the reimbursement is on time, it would arrive by the end of November. All good, no problems there. But in the meantime, we're already incurring expenses for the months of October and November, 2/3 of the way into that next quarter. So if a payment for the original reimbursement request is delayed by even 30 days, we're carrying 6 or more months of expenses, which causes many challenges. For both of these issues, I've spent countless hours tracking down answers and documents, making several alternative programmatic and financial plans, and adjusting timelines. None of this is planned for when we agree to a scope of work and budget, and adds to an already full set of responsibilities, which inevitably impacts our effectiveness in meeting our set deliverables. We are held accountable for ensuring our reports are submitted on time, but from our perspective, that accountability is not returned in kind. The impact of these delays are felt beyond our organization and affect our rapport with individuals and entities accessing services. As nonprofits, we work very hard to implement needs identified by the state, developing longstanding relationships with individuals and entities who are accessing the services we provide. For some initiatives, a nonprofit might be tasked with subgranting to other organizations through a state grant agreement. Those subrecipients or subrecipients would submit their own reimbursement requests to us, who would then combine them into one request for the state. Those entities trust that we'll follow through with the payment terms in their grant agreements, just as we, the state subrecipient, trust that we'll receive timely payment. That trust is eroded when delays occur, damaging the very entities or individuals we are supposed to be servicing. There are cases where we've been able to request advance payment based on what we expect the subrecipients to spend, and through careful accounting on our end and that of the state, that can be one way to be successful in eliminating that concern. Lastly, each of the state grants we have has a different reporting format and level of detail. Excuse me. Sometimes even within the same agency or department. Any streamlining of those processes would make our efforts more efficient and allow us to focus on the work at hand. As I mentioned at the beginning of my statement, our experience with state employees is that they are all working very hard to meet the needs of nonprofits, so we can in turn meet the needs of Vermont. But they're working within their own constraints, often understaffed and without proper technology and infrastructure. One state employee recently shared that individuals tasked with grants and contract processes in their agency went from 60 agreements to over 200 within the last several years. And that's per person. That's not sustainable, and we empathize with those individuals. So in addition to the ideas in H140, we would support a working group to consider needed reforms to the state's grant and contracting system to make it more viable, predictable, and efficient. I'm so grateful for the time to speak with you all today, and thank you for all the work you do on behalf of Vermonters.
Thanks for being with us today. I have one quick question before I turn it over to the committee, which you're describing in that last point that you made, that the folks that are working for the state and overseeing the grants went from managing 60 agreements to 200. Were you given a reason for why that's happened?
So what the state employee who shared that with me shared is that it's the folks that are actually preparing the grants and contracts, not the program managers, who I'm sure their workload has increased as well. The response that I received was largely due to the influx of pandemic dollars, but that they were understaffed to begin with. And that's certainly really concerning, and we understand then why those delays are happening, but it doesn't change the impact that happens on our end either.
Other questions from the committee? Right. Thank you very much for joining us today. We've heard a lot of testimony from a few different organizations that are serving Vermonters. To Representative Higley's point before, I think it would be worth it for us to come back to some of these topics next week and invite some representatives from the Agency of Administration and maybe a couple of the other agencies, including digital services, who work on some of these issues and might be able to provide us with their perspective. So we will definitely pick this back up and at least get that perspective, and then see where the committee is on trying to work on amendments and more language while we have other bills on the track as well. So unless anybody in the committee has anything else, I think we'll break a little bit early. And I want to thank everybody who came in on this. So we're done with the H-140 for today. The National Guard Caucus, the first of 4 presentations that I think is happening Pavilion.
Correct.
267?
267.
Second floor. So that'll be starting in 17 minutes. So I will probably be a little bit late for that because I have a new meeting with one of the commissioners. But this is just a day of being double booked. So with that, I'll let us break a little bit early and thank everybody for the robust